Proprio fa che te di qua, vedete che non è
Ana feri არ არის გამორიცხული.
Good morning, dear colleagues. The sitting is open. I remind members that they should insert their badge before taking the floor. As you begin your speech, please press the microphone button once only, wait for 2 seconds, and then speak. There have been changes to the proposed membership of committees. These are set out in Document Commissions 2024-06, Addendum 1. Are there proposed changes in the membership of the Assembly's committee agreed to? They agreed to. Next item of business is a debate under urgent procedure on the challenges to democracy in Georgia, document 16018, presented by the Committee on the Honoring of Obligations and Commitments by Member States of the Council of Europe, the so-called Monitoring Committee. In order to finish by 11:10 a.m., we will start to hear the replies to the debate at about 11 a.m. We will begin with Mr. Claude Kern and Mrs. Edith Estrella, co-rapporteurs. Mr. Kern, you have 5 minutes each. Oh, sorry, you have 5 minutes each. So, Edith Estrella will start first. Okay, ladies first. Edith, you have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, good morning, everyone, dear colleagues. The law on transparency of foreign influence, also known under the name of the law on foreign agents, is incompatible with European standards on democracy and human rights. According to the opinion of the Venice Commission, whose conclusions we fully support, the law is fundamentally mistaken. It infringes freedom of expression and of association. It harms political pluralism and democracy and must be repealed in its current form. The way in which the law was adopted, creating deep divisions within Georgian society and against recommendations and the warnings of the international community, raises questions regarding the commitment of the country towards European standards and to its willingness to honor its commitments towards the Council of Europe. In addition, there are questions which remain regarding the reasons for which the authorities initiated this law. The law has nothing to do with the financial transparency of civil society organizations or the media. Georgia already has a highly developed network to guarantee the transparency of financing of organizations, as well as comprehensive legislation to regulate lobbying. Furthermore, it does not aim at hindering secret and harmful foreign interference, but authorizes undue political control by the authorities of civil society and the media. As rapporteurs, we thus urge the authorities to repeal this law without delay. We also underscore our concerns regarding excessive and disproportionate use of force by the police and the violent attacks and campaigns of intimidation against demonstrators, civil society activists, journalists, and MPs. These attacks and acts of intimidation have not been the subject of sufficient investigation and have not been sufficiently condemned by the authorities, which could lead to a climate of impunity for such acts. However, adoption of the law is not the only sign that the country is given vis-à-vis its commitments in terms of democracy and the rule of law. On the contrary, this seems to have been the result of a series of worrying developments, whether we're talking about the blocking of reforms aimed at guaranteeing the independence of the judiciary, of non-consensual changes to the electoral code, or further, the introduction of a draft law on family values, which seems incompatible with the broadly accepted standards in terms of human rights, notably the European Human Rights Convention. This negative trend must be reversed. A short time ago, Georgia was often quoted as an example in the region for its capacity to conduct reforms and its willingness to commit itself to open and constructive dialogue with the international community. Developments on the law on transparency and foreign influence have changed this perception. Nonetheless, we're convinced of Georgia's capacity to overcome the challenges which appear on the route, and of its clear commitment of its people in favor of democracy and European integration. From our side, we restate the commitment to cooperation and constructive dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Edith. I now call Mr. Kern for 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, President. Dear colleagues, the adoption of this law on transparency of foreign influence in Georgia cannot be considered without also taking into account the upcoming legislative elections in this country. First of all, it is a major contribution, transformation of the elections coming up. It's a de facto referendum, in fact, regarding Georgia's democratic path and its alliance with countries next to it. And it also, of course, concerns polarization and tensions in the pre-electoral campaign environment. Secondly, this law will have a negative impact on the conduct of the elections, the confidence of the parties taking part, and the public in general in terms of its results, and this in turn can cast a doubt on the legitimacy of the elections and their outcome. And this will be particularly true if very experienced NGOs are unable to observe these elections. With that as a backdrop, we would like to express our concerns regarding the recent adoption of this, despite the recommendations proffered by the Venice Commission, adoption of amendments to the legal framework for these elections in Georgia, which really change the way in which the chair and the non-partisan members of the Central Election Commission are elected in Georgia. Also, last-minute changes concerning the majorities required for the CEC to be able to take decisions. Put together, these changes could well give the majority in office power and control over all decisions of the CEC, and this undermines the party's confidence in the electoral process. Having said that, we must remain optimistic. Georgian citizens have time and time again shown that they are committed to a development that is democratic for their country, and they do wish to continue with Euro-Atlantic integration, notwithstanding this political climate marked by hostility and repression. Edith and I would like to really exhort the authorities to recognize the hopes and the aspirations of the citizens of Georgia. They hope and aspire towards a democratic future, very much established in the European family. And these hopes and aspirations cannot be simply sidelined. They must be recognized and they must be respected. Therefore, we would like to put a question to the Georgian authorities. It's very straightforward, and it reads as follows. Are you still committed to a European future, and are you prepared to meet your obligations vis-à-vis the Council of Europe? And indeed, if that is the case, then we will, of course, continue to engage in dialogue, and my colleague, the co-rapporteur, already made this point. We very much stand by dialogue, constructive cooperation with all political forces in the country in order to make sure that this genuinely does happen. Therefore, dear colleagues, I very much hope that you will support our draft resolution. Thank you, President.
Thank you, Mr. Kern. I now open the speakers list, starting with the representatives of the political groups, and I call first the leader of Socialists, Democrats and Greens, Mr. Frank Zwabe.
Dear Mr. President, dear colleagues, thank you very much. Georgia is a member of this organization since 1999. And although it was not always very easy and we had to discuss a lot of things, it was clear that Georgia was going a direct way to Europe and in a way to respect our values. And I don't know why Georgia is leaving this way now. This Council of Europe, this Parliamentary Assembly is the guardian of the values. And because of this, we send a clear signal today to Georgia. And I would like to thank very much to our co-rapporteurs Edith Estrella and Claude Kern to present a very impartial report, but with this very clear signal. We have concerns about the rhetorics in the country. So if Mr. Ivanishvili speaks about the influence from outside, who does he mean? It's us. My impression is he means us. It's our influence he don't like. We are concerned about the rhetorics and the law against LGBTIQ. We are for sure concerned about the rhetorics and the law about foreign agents. But my biggest concern, and I think our biggest concern, should be towards the elections on the 26th of October. And I spoke on Monday about those countries who are wanting to be part in this organization but not respecting our values and rules. So the price to be a democratic country is that you can lose elections. This is part of the deal with democracy and with us as an organization. And if you really intervene now in the Central Election Commission, very close to the elections, and against all the recommendations from international organizations, then we are very concerned. And it looks like that you want to prevent that people can control the ballot boxes. And this is about the foreign agents laws as well. Against those one from the EU, for example, who support those one who try to protect the ballot boxes. So we should do everything to support the civil society, to defend the ballot boxes. We should send, and we will do so, one of the biggest election observation missions to the country, and we will do our best there. And Julia Mbulai, the chair of the ALDE group, will be the chair of this election observation mission. So we do our job, and we are still open for discussion and communications, but we send a very clear message today. Do not undermine our institutions. Do not attack the Venice Commission as one of an organization with the highest credibility all over the world. Come back to a way towards Europe in respecting our rules and values. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Babe. I now call on behalf of EPP, Madame Ingrid Skau. Ingrid.
President and colleagues, 1 month ago, the Standing Committee met in Vilnius. It was soon after the law on foreign agents had been passed, soon after thousands of Georgians had taken to the streets, demonstrating against the law. Our current affairs debate in Vilnius was timely. Our debate today is urgent. The Georgian democracy is backsliding towards an illiberal democracy, and the country's democratic forces are under heavy pressure. The Council of Europe must send a strong message to the Georgian authorities that their actions are in breach with our standards. At the same time, the Council should be equally visible and strong in its support to the democratic opposition's forces. The draft resolution from the Monitoring Committee contains several examples of problematic legislation, not only the law on foreign agents. Problematic changes have been made to the electoral code, and there is problematic draft legislation on protecting of family values coming up. I strongly encourage Georgia to follow the advice of the Venice Commission. From Georgian colleagues, I have learned that the situation in Georgia is not only what the ruling party depicts. 80% want Georgia to stay on the path to Europe. They want European integration and EU membership. There are strong forces in Georgia fighting for democracy and for Georgia to reverse the democratic backsliding. But as we have already heard from Georgian colleagues here in this room, there is widespread intimidation and brutal crackdowns on demonstrators by the police. People do not feel safe. Georgians also feel the threat from Russia. They feel unsafe, they are afraid that they will suffer the same fate as Ukraine. The parliamentary election in Georgia will take place in late October. I'm very glad that we will send a larger than normal both pre-electoral mission and election monitoring delegation. For this election monitoring, the pre-election period will be crucial, especially with the new law on foreign agents. The situation for civil society, media, and opposition key actors in elections might be difficult. International observers during the campaign period will therefore be of great importance. We know that oligarchs with substantial wealth invested in European countries are in position of power in Georgia. I believe that at one point, we should start considering how we can limit their influence. Sanctions may be one alternative. We want to keep Georgia in the path to Europe. We must send a strong message. I encourage all colleagues to vote in favor of the resolution, and I'd like to thank the rapporteurs, especially for a very solid report. Thank you, President.
Thank you, Ingrid. Lord Keane, as I see that Lord King is not here, I'm going to give him some time. Maybe he's coming. So I'm going to pass the floor now to Bjarni Johnson on behalf of ALDE.
Mr. President, with the political crisis in Georgia intensifying, the urgency for constructive and open dialogue becomes more apparent. Following the recommendations of the rapporteurs, it is important that the Parliamentary Assembly strongly expresses its deep concern about the recent developments in Georgia. These developments raise questions about the country's commitment to international democratic norms and Euro-Atlantic integration, and put into question Georgia's willingness to honor its membership obligations and accession commitments to the Council of Europe. The Assembly should, as recommended by the rapporteurs, express its full support for the urgent opinion of the Venice Commission on the law on transparency of foreign influence. This law, along with the way it was adopted by the Georgian Parliament, is incompatible with European democratic and human rights standards, as they are reflected in the obligations and commitments of Georgia to the Council of Europe. Deep concerns also have to be raised over the excessive use of force by the police. At the same time as we call for this dangerous path to be reversed, we need to support Georgia's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and I applaud the admirable resilience that Georgia has shown in deterring Russian aggression throughout the years. The status of the temporarily occupied regions of Georgia and their people is of great concern. Demonstrating unity around democratic values is one of our strongest tools against Russia's blatant violations of international law and the multilateral order. Georgia's obtainment of European Union candidate status last December was a historical moment, and the next few months will play a critical role in seeing this opportunity through. We should express a strong wish to see Georgia succeed. The recent adoption of the transparency law risks thwarting process towards this goal. Law on transparency of foreign influence is not an isolated event, but the culmination of a series of developments that clearly indicate a democratic backsliding by the country. This trend needs to be reversed. The Venice Commission was clear in the recommendation to the government to repeal this law, as its fundamental flaws will involve significant negative consequences for the freedoms of association and expression, the right to privacy, the right to participate in public affairs, as well as the prohibition of discrimination. Ultimately, this will affect open, informed public debate, pluralism, and democracy. In recent months, large groups of Georgian citizens have spoken clearly in favor of free expression and open debate. I hope that the upcoming elections will provide an opportunity for Georgians to make their opinion heard and then return to the path towards the democratic and secure European future its people deserve.
Thank you, Bjarni. Lord King, on behalf of the European Conservatives.
Thank you, President. Thank you, colleagues. I want to concentrate as much on process as content so far as this issue is concerned. And of course, it's very important to maintain a clear distinction between what might be termed lobbying and what can be regarded as the chilling effects of a foreign agent's law. Of course, not all foreign agency legislation is going to be unacceptable. But it must meet certain criteria of legality, legitimacy, and indeed necessity or proportionality. And the concern that I would express with regard to the recent legislative process in Georgia is that it doesn't meet any of these requirements, and nor did it attempt to do so. We know that legislation was originally introduced in March of 2023, and then, in the face of independent condemnation, withdrawn. We know also that where such legislation is introduced, very often it is processed in a very speedy manner in order to limit objection and to avoid consultation with relevant parties. And what happened in the present case was that legislation, which had been withdrawn in March of 2023, was reintroduced in April of 2024, and I think it's fair to say effectively rushed through the legislature in Georgia. Now, I know that the Georgian government will say that they did not make a reference to the Venice Commission with regard to this legislation, and that is correct. But they were well aware of the concerns expressed elsewhere, which led to a reference to the Venice Commission by the President and others for an urgent opinion in respect of the legislation. And being aware of that request for an urgent opinion from the Venice Commission, did Georgia hold back? And the answer is no. We saw a legislative process that ended up with the legislation being passed following a third reading, which, according to the Venice Commission opinion, was hardly in the public domain. And the only excuse now levelled for the passing of that legislation without proper consultation and without awaiting the opinion of the Venice Commission is that they anticipated a presidential veto in Georgia. But that is no excuse for the passing of unacceptable legislation in the face of the absence, I should say, rather than in the face of, in the absence of the Venice Commission opinion. And my concern is that the conduct of Georgia in respect of this legislation is not compatible with their obligations under the statute of the Council of Europe, and in particular, their obligations under Article 3 to display utmost good faith in their dealings. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord King. I pass the floor now to Andrei Hunko, leader of the United European Left.
Vielen Dank, Herr.
Thank you very much, President. Ladies and gentlemen, perhaps first of all, let me say that I'm also concerned about the developments in Georgia, precisely when it comes to this move towards a potential polarization of society. I'm not sure whether all interventions from outside were actually helpful in the course of that development. But let me point out that I've been to Georgia several times as an electoral monitor. In 2019, I had the honor to lead the mission observing the presidential elections. And at that time, it struck me just how far Georgia had developed in democratic ways, in particular when it comes to the transition from a procedural to a parliamentary system. It is in a very difficult geopolitical position. Two republics are occupied and the troops are only a few kilometers away from Tbilisi. And I always understood that the government tried to pursue a pragmatic policy and to remain attractive beyond their borders so that they could actually attract people to come back home. And when I now consider that there are several thousand NGOs in Georgia which are funded from abroad, those are the official figures, and which are active, then I can understand initially that there's this wish for transparency. I don't know whether the wish goes beyond just transparency. I have to say I'm very critical of this, and that the amendments to electoral laws also seem to me very problematic. Now, I'm also thinking about Euro-Atlantic integration, which we had hoped would happen, but I don't think that's the task of this assembly. There are other countries who want to join NATO and the EU, others don't. But I think that's the wrong approach. That's often just seen as being a substitute for EU and NATO accession. So some things here I have to say I reject, because I think it's completely wrong in such a sensitive situation to talk here about sanctions or introducing a process of exclusion, in fact. I think that's really questionable. So I hope that a large electoral monitoring mission from here will help solve the problem to ensure that those elections are balanced and objective, and that the will of the Georgian people really can be expressed in those elections in October. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrei. I give now the floor to Givi Mikanadze.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to use this opportunity, first of all, to congratulate Georgian football national team with a historic victory we've got yesterday at Euro 24 and passing to the playoff match, so I want to use this opportunity. And getting back to the business, today, when it is 4 months prior to the upcoming parliamentary elections and we discuss situation in Georgia, let me emphasize several points on circumstances around the law on transparency that caused hot debates and generated controversial positions. The necessity of making NGO sector transparent to protect countries' sovereignty and stability became apparent due to the numerous cases of NGOs introduced, for instance, that NGOs introduced false data on parallel voting turbulence during the parliamentary elections. Unfortunately, this disinformation became ground for manifestations with the request to annul the election results. Later, this NGO had to admit that their PVT results were indeed in line with the official figures. The second widely publicized case was connected to the EU candidacy status, which was unfairly denied to Georgia in 2022. NGOs then organized protests blaming the government and requiring its resignation. This process made clear that some NGOs had crossed neutrality line and had become involved in politics. There were several cases when NGOs and media organizations had been used for indirect funding of opposition parties, particularly during the recent years where opposition parties established a number of so-called NGOs that got big amounts of funding. NGO sector in Georgia became most non-transparent as stated in Moneywall 2020 report. Consequently, the law on transparency was adopted, which requires the NGOs and media organizations to declare once a year their financial funding if the foreign funding exceeds 20%. As the majority of oppositions and NGOs were against such transparency, protests have taken place, further escalated into violent ones. As for the police actions, it was following legislation, and in a number of cases, policemen were injured. On a number of cases, on possible excessive use of force, the Independent Investigation Bureau is holding investigation, and all information has been communicated to the CPT. The first article of the law guarantees to the NGOs and media organizations that the law will not harm or impede their activities. The only sanction introduced by the law is a fine. The special survey conducted countrywide has highlighted that the majority of Georgian population is in favor of the law. Currently, we face the reality where similar and even stricter laws in other countries are regarded as the protection of security and independence of these countries. However, it is the opposite in case of Georgia, which also urgently needs to respond to global threats and its protect sovereignty. Today we are considering draft resolution which highlights issues related to the adopted legislation on transparency and accountability. What is interesting is that this law has not even entered into force and will not be operational before end of July. It means we are considering and going to adopt a resolution about the legislation without waiting to see the outcomes of the law. Similar situation is with regard to the LGBTQI+ propaganda draft bill, which is only on its first hearing and will be adopted by the end of September. As for the composition of the Central Election Commission, out of 17 members of the Commission, the ruling party is presented only by 1 member, while 8 are opposition members and 8 neutral members of the CEC. We have directed invitation to the PACE for the election observation mission 6 months prior to the elections, and we are waiting and welcoming observation mission. I want to assure you that Georgia remains committed to the principles and values of the Council of Europe and is eager to continue reforms and discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Gibi. I would add my congratulations to the Georgian football team, but of course, since I saw that Edith, who's come from Portugal, is here, I was humbled to speak, but we can add congratulations to the Georgian football team and asking for fair play, not only in football, but in the next elections in Georgia. So let me give now the floor to Hanna Chitlige.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure the Council of Europe remembers very well famous Georgian words spoken by the former Prime Minister of Georgia, Zurab Zhuania. Then Georgia became the member of the European Council. I'm Georgian, therefore I'm European. Today, I'm standing in this hall. I'm repeating these words very loudly and proudly. I'm Georgian, therefore I'm European. But in this hall today, I want to be more loud and to say to all of you, the European integration and democracy development of my country is under the danger. Russian oligarch Ivanishvili decided to change Georgia's geopolitical way from Europe to Russia, from democracy development to oligarchy system. This Russian law is only one tiny aspect in a big plan of Russian oligarch. And big plan is to kick out Europe from the region and increase Russian influence. What happens now in Georgia? It's not only Georgian struggle, it's Europeans too. If democracy fails in Georgia, European values will be failed in the region. Russian oligarch Ivanishvili can keep his power only in the Russian and oligarchy system, where political opponents and civil activists are in prison. Their critical voices are suppressed, where democracy is only words and not more. And in this case, we should always remember men who made Georgia's European integration irreversible. Mikhail Saakashvili, former president of Georgia, in the prison, jailed by pro-Russian oligarch of Georgia. Ladies and gentlemen, the capital of Europe now is Tbilisi. The European flags flies high in the streets of Tbilisi, holding by new generation. Thousands of Georgians now are watching to you and waiting from you very strong signals that Europe never leaves Georgia in his way of European integration and democracy development. No to Russian oligarch, yes to Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Oleksiy Goncharenko is next.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. First of all, I want to congratulate Georgian football team and Georgia with this great success. Sakartvelo Pikhburti is super. That's true. Georgian football is super, and that's a great news. Unfortunately, that's the last great news for Georgia today. Because what we see there, it's not about Russian law, it's not just about democracy, it's about losing its independence. That's very important to understand. We just see on our eyes Belarusization of Georgia. That's true. Real shadow governor of Georgia, Russian oligarch Ivanishvili, is already openly justifying Russian aggression against Ukraine and even Russian aggression against Georgia. For you to know, Ivanishvili said on a big rally in Tbilisi that it's not Russia who is guilty for attack on Georgia in 2008. It is not Russia who is guilty in attack on Ukraine in 2014 and 2022. But it's so-called war party of the West, global war party, something like this, warmongers. It's we. Because we are discussing Georgia, we want to see Georgia European. That's why we are guilty. Russia is not. That's what's happening right now in Georgia. So this is a clear path of Belarusization. First, they have a prisoners of Kremlin, and I just want to remind you that Mikhail Saakashvili, I am not his political fan and never have been, but he is a Kremlin prisoner. It's clear. And our assembly here 2 years ago, in 2022, we voted with you with an address to Georgian government to release Saakashvili as soon as possible. It was ignored. Then they are killing democracy. For this, they are using Russian law, Russian agenda, and everything else. Because Russia is standing behind Ivanishvili, I am sure about this. Then you know what will happen. They did it in Belarus, and then they occupy the country and kill the independence of country at all. A lot is at stake now. So much. It's not about politics. It's not. It's about existence of Georgia. And I want to address Georgian people. We will do here what we can. We will adopt today this resolution with the strong words against this Russian law. Hey, by the way, just I want to remind you, it's not we are saying this. It's Venice Commission said that it's awful law. And here Georgian government representatives is protecting, say, great law, just wait how it will work. We know how it will work. You will kill democracy, that's all. I address to Georgian people, Dzirpasa mego brebo, Dzirpaso dzmebo. Protect your country. This is the last battle. If you will not do this now, then you will lose not just your freedom, but you will lose Georgia, which is something which shouldn't happen, and you still can stop it. Do it. We are with you. Ukraine, Europe, all people who are for democracy are standing shoulder to shoulder to you. But we can't replace you in this fight. Thank you very much. Sakartvelo, Gaumarjos.
Thank you. Beatrice Fresco-Rolfo next.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, President. I'm really worried about what's going to happen with this bill currently being discussed by the Georgian Parliament, which aims to ban gender recognition, ban gender reassignment, surgery or hormone treatment, ban also so-called LGBTI propaganda content in education and media. Propaganda is a very harsh word, but also adoption or even fostering by same-sex couples. Furthermore, the bill seeks to restrict freedom of assembly. Indeed, meetings, gatherings, demonstrations that supposedly promote same-sex relationships would not be authorized, and nor would demonstrations in public. The text that we're talking about here talks about LGBTI propaganda, and yet all this really is a message to promote tolerance, open-mindedness. We're talking here about fundamental values of the Council of Europe, and we need to safeguard protection for all, against all forms of discrimination. We need to also make sure that we promote gender equality. The same bill would also like to transform the 17th of May into a celebration of the sacredness of the family. Now, I would remind you that the 17th of May is actually the internationally recognised day to fight discrimination and hatred against LGBTI persons, Idaho. It's something that we've been celebrating for years now around the world. If this bill were to be approved, and I think that's what's scheduled for September, what's going to happen to LGBTI people in Georgia? Are they going to be even more stigmatised? Will they have to leave the country? And what happens to the prevention and fight against discrimination when you bear in mind that the law actually contains discriminatory provisions? And what's going to happen to LGBTI people going forward? I actually talked about this on the 26th of June, in other words, yesterday, with the leader of the Georgian delegation. I expressed my deep concerns. Already back in 2022, when we had Mr. Lacroix's report, the Assembly invited the Georgian authorities to include into their anti-discrimination legislation concepts such as gender expression and sex characteristics. Also, to make sure that legislation and policies on equality and non-discrimination were fully implemented, and also to fight against hate speech, LGBTI-phobic speech in the public sphere and in politics, and setting up a forum for dialogue, particularly with the Orthodox Church, in order to bring calm to the representatives of the Church regarding their position on public demonstrations such as Pride, and making sure that we raise awareness. We need to avoid stigmatization of the LGBTI community. Now, as our former Human Rights Commissioner Dunja Mijatovic said, this particular bill is reflective of entrenched harmful stereotypes and prejudice against LGBTI people which still prevail in segments of Georgian society, including some politicians, and it's capable of having a strong negative impact on the human rights, safety and well-being of LGBTI people and defenders of their rights. It also represents the political manipulation of LGBTI phobia in the run-up to elections." End of quote. LGBTI individuals have the same human rights as everyone else. They should not be used for manipulative purposes in the run-up to elections. I therefore call upon the Georgian authorities not to adopt this bill, which really goes against the principles and the values defended by the Council of Europe. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Beatrice. Gergely Arato is next.
Dear Assembly, it is always difficult to find a moment when democracy begins to fade and disappear. What is the point when political fighting, the legitimate interest of individual political groups, turns into restriction on political competition and free expression of opinion? However, regrettably, we have seen in Hungary and elsewhere the consequences of the slide towards an authoritarian system and how steps limiting democracy accumulate in such a way that the process becomes always irreversible. No one in this assembly questions the right of people of Georgia to choose their own government. No one doubts that Georgia legitimate authorities govern the countries. But this governance is not unlimited. It is precisely in the protection of democracy and the rights of the Georgian people that the obligations undertaken by all of us represent limit. When we raise our voice here because of the violation of democratic rights, we do not do it to take away the independence of Georgia and the freedom of the Georgian people. On the contrary, we are here to protect the people of Georgia. Sovereignty does not mean the unlimited rule of one party or another, but the freedom of decision of people. We defend this sovereignty of the Georgian people so that their right and opportunity to determine their own destiny and their own life. That is why we interested in starting a meaningful and effective dialogue that guarantees the enforcement of our common democratic values and thus the sovereignty of the Georgian people.
Thank you, Gergely. Maria Mezentseva is next.
Yes, thank you, dear President. Mr. Rosopoulos, dear colleagues, I wish we never had this resolution to be tabled or to be debated. I am speaking right now as a Ukrainian. I am speaking right now as a fan of Georgia. I am speaking right now as a chairwoman of the Committee on Equality and Non-Discrimination. I am speaking right now as a chairwoman of Women Democracy Network Eastern Region in Ukraine. I have had a Skype conversation with representatives of Women Democracy Network from Georgia who informed me that the backlash in gender equality, LGBTI rights, the draft law that was already voted in the first reading are not promoting something that Georgian colleagues were voting here and adhere their work for. But this is not only about that, colleagues. This frightens me a lot because Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova were usually in a trio that was moving to the EU integration. And some days and some years ago, Georgia was even #1 in reforms and was a great example to follow. Currently, we understand that the people are not heard. The Venice Commission is not heard, which actually referred to the law on foreign influence, so-called, because it considers that the law, and I'm citing in the manner in which it was adopted by the Georgian parliament, is not in compliance with human rights standards and European democratic values. This is very sad that we see what we've seen in my home country. We see the attacks of police on protesters. We see that the parliament doesn't hear their voters. The parliament doesn't hear their people. This is a geopolitical issue. This is not an issue only of the Georgian nation or the Georgian people. I think the amendments that we introduced, and there are 5 of them, unfortunately not all the members were present in the committee to comment. I hope we can pass them on here because they also call to release political prisoners like Mikhail Saakashvili, which Ukrainian parliament has called upon numerous times as well. Colleagues, I don't know if this resolution or passing this resolution would be enough signal for the Georgian authorities and our colleagues in Georgian parliament, but it definitely will be a good signal to support the people in Georgia. The people are deciding their future. The people are electing politicians. And if politicians think that they are there forever, they're not. And many countries have showed this example. Madlova.
Thank you, dear Maria. Ketevan Turazashvili is next.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to congratulate the national football team of Georgia on yesterday's amazing victory over Portugal. We are very proud of you. Thanks to all the initiators for inserting the debate into the current session week. The ruling party initiated the law for the 2nd time and finally adopted it, which was withdrawn last year based on the Georgian people's demand. The so-called foreign agents law threatens democracy in Georgia. Georgia's European future puts the right to dissent at risk and damages Georgian-EU and Georgian-USA relations. Instead of considering the cause of strategic partners and the demands of hundreds of thousands of demonstrators, the ruling party started dispersing demonstrations using violent methods. Police officers, of course, following the instruction of the government, beat some participants of the protests, the leaders of the opposition parties, including the leader of my party, a member of the parliament, Mr. Elisashvili, who was detained illegally by the police officers, who ignored the fact that MP is protected by the immunity. Besides, around 200 demonstrators have been detained, but none of the police officers have been punished so far. Of course, all this proves that democracy in Georgia is facing challenges. It's a fact that the ruling party uses all kinds of violent methods, intimidation, threats, and ambushes against all people who oppose the adopted law. There were also cases of intimidation and following of me and my family members. Even though I have applied to appropriate state bodies, the investigation has done nothing yet. The ruling party accuses the leaders and ambassadors of strategic partners and international organizations, including the Venice Commission, of being biased. All this creates doubts that the Georgian dream will use non-democratic methods to maintain power in the next election. Therefore, the role of all international observation missions will be crucial in the upcoming election. I'm glad that Bureau of the Parliamentary Assembly decided to observe the elections. European states should also impose individual sanctions on those who threaten democracy and the European future in Georgia. The most important thing is that the Georgian people are not going to give up on the European future and get used to legislation that takes them far from the European Union. Georgian people see and feel the support of European leaders, which will become even more important for the coming very hard election process. Thank you.
Thank you. Markus Wissel.
Microphone for the speaker, please.
Sorry, Marcus, we cannot listen to you. Just press the button once. Have you inserted your badge? Have you inserted your badge?
It is.
Okay, now we can listen to you.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was among those many who in the spring pushed for the new Georgian legislation on so-called foreign influence to be urgently debated in our midst. And here we are doing just that, and I commend the Assembly for the speed of reaction. And the title of our debate implies that the foreign influence legislation represents a real threat to Georgian democracy, and in fact it represents a threat to European democracy. In brief, it focuses on any non-governmental organizations whose budgets are financed from abroad by over 20% to open up all their internal documents for scrutiny by the authorities. These NGOs must also register as agents of foreign influence. Such a label is, of course, highly suggestive and would open up new possible charges of unlawful activity. The whole democratic system of freedom of assembly and expression might soon dissolve. The new legislation brings to mind the almost identical foreign agent law introduced in Russia in 2012. It had the effect of immediately stifling any meaningful opposition to that country's dictatorial regime. And many in this assembly now fear that Georgia could undergo a similar process. The massive popular demonstrations that have been held in the Georgian capital and elsewhere in the country show very much the same thing. In this context, however, it is good to know that Georgia is a long-standing and respected member of our Council of Europe. In addition, it is, of course, partially to our European Convention on Human Rights, and its foreign minister sits on our organization's Committee of Ministers. Thanks to all this, there is every hope and expectation that our Assembly, and especially our Monitoring Committee, will be able to remedy the situation and at least water down the application of the new legislation. This would be in the interests of the wishes of the Georgian people too, as the expression goes, to be on the right side of history. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Marcus. Stefan Bergeron is next.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, chers collègues.
Thank you, dear colleagues. Polls show that more than 80% of the population of Georgia is in favor of their country's accession to the EU. We're talking about an aspiration which, like accession to NATO, is written in the Georgian constitution. That's why adoption by the Georgian parliament of this to the Russian law, in particular regarding the media and the NGOs, is likely supposedly to ensure a legitimate monitoring, and unfortunately is likely to have other effects. Like the Ukrainian population during their revolution, the Georgians don't want their European dreams be wiped out and their country returned to an authoritarian regime, with the vote of the parliament being overcome by the president's veto and suppression of demonstration. Unfortunately, the country seems to be heading in the same direction, but the international community did react. The United States imposed travel restrictions on dozens of Georgians, and the EU and its member states have considered all options and could even adopt new measures this week. The reaction of the Canadian government, on the other hand, was a lower key. The foreign minister simply published a very loose statement on X. The legislation of the government in force when it comes to foreign influence is contrary to fundamental rights and freedoms. Now, this restraint can perhaps be explained by the fact that the House of Commons in Canada unanimously adopted a law which foresaw the setting up a register in Canada for transparency when it comes to foreign influence. I can imagine that some of our colleagues in Georgia may well ask whether we were not guilty of some hypocrisy. And although I'm a member of the Canadian Parliament, I think that this bill will protect Canadians from the threat of foreign interference while protecting their fundamental rights and freedoms. And so that, to me, is the difference. But it is possible to do both. That's to say, to prevent foreign interference while protecting citizens' rights and freedoms. As to the future, the Georgian population will be called to speak during elections. The speaker's microphone has gone off. Sorry. During parliamentary elections to be held in October. I hope that those elections will be free and fair so that the people of Georgia can have the last word at the polling station. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Stefan. Sara Sofia Siren is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. President. Thank you for this report. The report sends a very clear, very important, very timely message. The recent actions by the Georgian Parliament and authorities do raise a serious concern and a question regarding the country's commitment to European democratic values. This concern is, of course, also linked to the upcoming elections. There is a strong concern, especially considering the laws raised here during the debate, as well as the excessive use of force and attacks on civil society activists, journalists, and even members of parliament. These examples are very alarming. These actions are not in line with the standards that we have for democracy, equality, human rights, and the rule of law. Therefore, it is crucial that we stand in solidarity with the pro-European forces in Georgia. It's crucial that we support these people who are committed to democratic development and further integration into the European family. We need to support Georgians who continue to demonstrate their aspirations for a democratic future firmly anchored within Europe. Commitment to needed reforms to strengthen the rule of law and democracy are, of course, also crucial steps on the path towards EU membership. Dear colleagues, we must support and recognize efforts of citizens and political forces in Georgia who are dedicated to upholding democratic European values. What are we here for? We are here to work towards a future where democratic values, democratic principles, European values are upheld and respected. I agree with Mr. President. We need fair play on the football court as well as in politics. This is a very strong message from us to Georgia. Thank you.
Thank you, Sara Sofia. And that concludes the list of speakers. Dear colleagues, in a moment I shall call Mr. Kern and Mrs. Estrella, co-rapporteurs, to reply. You both have 5 minutes in total. I call first Madame Estrella.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, chers collègues.
Thank you very much, President. Dear colleagues, well, first of all, it is a matter of fair play. We have to be upstanding both in victory and defeat. And in the spirit of fair play, therefore, I would like to congratulate Georgia on its victory over my own country yesterday, Portugal. This result did not really change Portugal's position. It's still in pole position, but I think it was very important for Georgia to have won that particular game. That being said, I would like to thank all of my colleagues. Thank you very much to all those who took the floor in this debate. And very briefly, if I may, I would like to remind you that the Council of Europe was created 75 years ago now, after the Second World War, and it was created in order to defend human rights, the rule of law, and democracy. These are our values, the Council of Europe's values, and we continue to defend them and we continue to promote them. These are European values. These are the values of the Council of Europe. Whether you look at the past, whether you look at the present, whether you look at the future, across the board, these are our values. The draft resolution that we have tabled before the House, and we very much hope that this draft resolution will be approved by the Assembly, its purpose is really to appeal to the Georgian authorities, asking them not to depart from the founding values of the Council of Europe. I conclude. I would like to once again put out an appeal to the authorities of Georgia: repeal the law on transparency in matters of foreign influence. Thank you.
Mr. Kern.
Thank you, President. Dear colleagues, I in turn would like to thank you for hearing your different points of view and for your support. Might I recall here that in Georgia there already are several laws on transparency of foreign entrepreneurial and non-entrepreneurial organizations. There was no hurry and no need to vote in a new law. Above all, when in 2023, after several visits from us, we came to an agreement that that law be definitively withdrawn. So why has it been brought back into play in 2024? I think it also helpful to recall that we certainly don't want to interfere in elections or the way that elections are conducted, hence electoral monitoring and its task, which we consider very important. Let me also recall that in 2022, when my former colleague Titus Koleam was co-rapporteur, and we proposed the end of monitoring, noting the progress that had been made in that country. Unfortunately, there has been some backsliding. So what we want to do today, Edita and I, is to launch a resound appeal to a return so we can have constructive dialogue, respecting commitments entered into towards the Council of Europe for compliance with human rights and for compliance with European values. That is our resounding appeal that we launch here through this resolution, which we hope will receive great support from you. Thank you, President.
Thank you, Mr. Kern. Does the chairperson of the committee, Madame Zanda Kalina Lukasiewicz, wish to speak? You have 3 minutes, Zanda.
Dear President, thank you, dear colleagues. It is with great regret that the committee is today presenting a report in an urgent debate on the challenges to democracy in Georgia. For years, Georgia was seen as an example in the region for its capacity to reform and its willingness to cooperate with the Council of Europe in honoring its membership obligations and commitments. Today, we discuss a resolution in which we express concerns about the country's democratic backsliding. This is quite a contradiction. The draft resolution is clear. The recent developments in Georgia raise serious doubts about the country's commitment to international democratic norms and Euro-Atlantic integration, as well as its willingness to honor its membership obligations and accession commitments to the Council of Europe. The law on transparency on foreign influence, as well as the manner in which it was adopted by the Georgian parliament, are incompatible with European democratic and human rights standards. The resolution therefore urges the authorities to repeal the law without any further delay. The committee deplores the excessive and disproportionate use of the force by the police and the violent attacks and campaigns against demonstrators, civil society activists, journalists, and members of parliament, which amount to a crackdown on legitimate display of disagreement. These attacks are not sufficiently investigated and condemned by the authorities, which could lead to a climate of impunity for such acts. Such acts can have no place in democratic society. Regrettably, the controversial adoption of the law on transparency on foreign influence is not an isolated event, but the culmination of a series of developments that indicate a turn contradicting democratic principles. The situation cannot be seen separate from the upcoming elections in Georgia, which now have turned in a de facto referendum on Georgia's democratic trajectory and foreign alignment. And the committee therefore urges the authorities to reverse this trend and fully commit themselves to honoring the country's membership obligations and accession commitments to the Council of Europe. At the same time, the committee reiterates its commitment to cooperation and dialogue with all political forces in the country and pays tribute to the commitment of Georgian citizens to the country's democratic development and further Euro-Atlantic integration, which they have continued to demonstrate during the recent developments. The hopes and aspirations of the Georgian citizens for a democratic future firmly anchored within the European family must be recognized and respected. Dear colleagues, to conclude, I would like to use this opportunity to congratulate Georgia on its victory in football yesterday. This victory, I believe, can serve as a guiding light. Following the rules and learning from the best, you can win. And actually, it is the only way to a victory. So I call the Assembly to support this resolution presented by the committee. And lastly, on behalf of the committee, I would like to really thank both rapporteurs, Madame Estrela and Mr. Kern, for their comprehensive report that was produced in a very short time, and also many thanks to the Secretariat for their support. Thank you, President.
Thank you, Zanda. The Committee on the Honoring, the debate is closed. The Committee on the Honoring of Obligations and Commitments by Member States of the Council of Europe has presented a draft resolution to which 5 amendments have been tabled. Any amendment which has been rejected by the committee, seized for report by a 2/3 majority of the votes cast, shall not be put to the vote in plenary and shall not be declared as definitely rejected unless 10 or more members of the Assembly object. I understand that the chairperson of the committee wishes to propose to the Assembly that amendments 2, 3, 4, and 5 to the draft resolution, which were rejected by the committee with a 2/3 majority, be declared as rejected. Is that so? I have to ask first Zanda, and then I will give you the floor. Is that floor Mrs. Kalina Lukasevica?
Yes, several amendments were rejected by a 2/3 majority.
Okay. Mr. Goncharenko.
Thank you, President. As I know, unfortunately, many members of the Monitoring Committee, because there were several committees at the same time, were not at place. I think this is a very important amendment. And just, you heard all the speeches. All political groups, all spokespersons said, we need to react. And this is a very important thing to say, amendment number 2. So I would like to ask to raise this amendment and to support it. And I want to ask for your support. Thank you.
Yeah, as I said, the request of the committee is rejected, so each amendment will be taken.
We need 10 people. Did 10
Yeah, we need 10 people to raise on this proposal by Mr. Goncharenko, so we have 10. Maria, even injured is dynamic, you know that. So now I call Mr. Cross to support Amendment 1. You have 30 seconds.
Amendment 1 was supported by the committee by large majority, and only the rest were rejected. Amendment 1 is supported by the committee.
Does anyone else wish to support this amendment? Does anyone wish to speak against the amendment? What is the opinion of the committee? We have already said it. So, I'll put it now to the vote. The vote is open. It's Amendment 1. I have 71 that had voted already. So, Petra, you said that you cannot vote?
No, it's okay.
Okay. Alles Gute. The vote is closed. I call for the result to be displayed. Amendment 1 is adopted. Amendment 2. I call Mr. Goncharenko to support Amendment 2 in 30 seconds.
Thank you, President. Dear colleagues, thank you very much for support. That's the only one amendment on which I and colleagues we insist. Only one. But this is very important because it's saying about Georgian path to European Union. And it's saying about recent statements of Bidzina Ivanishvili about justifying the Russian Federation's war of aggression against Ukraine. I said about this in my speech. This is very dangerous, and we need to put our attention on this. We can't put our blind eye. And there is no word here about Mr. Ivanishvili, who is really a shadow governor of Georgia. I think it's not right, so please support just this amendment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexei. Does anyone else wish to support this amendment? Yes, Mr. Gross. All right. Anyone wish to speak against the amendment?
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. J'ai vu l'influence.
I saw the influence that mentioned by a colleague Gorchenko regarding this, but by quoting several people, we thought that when it came to the rapporteurs and the committee level, we thought that's direct interference in the elections, and that's certainly not the role of our assembly to have direct interference in an election campaigns. That's why we're against.
Mr. Kern, I shall now put the amendment to the vote. The vote is open. The vote is closed. I call now for the result to be displayed. Amendment 2 is rejected. Amendment number 3, I call Mr. Goncharenko to support amendment number 3. You have 30 seconds.
Thank you very much. As I told you, now we will follow the position of the committee in all other amendments, so it was rejected, so I do not insist on other amendments. Thank you.
Does anyone? Yes, Mrs. Lucassen.
The amendment was rejected in the committee by 2/3.
By 2/3 majority, you said? Okay. I shall put now the amendment to the vote. The vote is open.
It's not supposed to.
It's not.
Sorry, you withdrew it. So, okay. So since the amendment was withdrawn, we don't have to vote. Let's go now to amendment number 4. I call Mr. Cross to support amendment number 4 in 30 seconds. So you are talking about amendment 3, amendment 4, amendment 5. Am I right, Mr. Koncharenko? Okay, now we will proceed then to vote on the draft resolution contained in document 16018 as amended. The vote is open. The vote is closed, and I call for the result to be displayed. The draft resolution in document 16018 as amended is adopted. Dear colleagues, the next item of business this morning is a debate on the report titled An Urgent Call to Europe and its Partners, Envisioning Immediate and Long-Term Policy Solutions in Support of the Displaced Persons of Ukraine, document 16002, presented by Liz Selnes on behalf of the Committee on Migration, Refugees and Displaced Persons. In order to finish by 1 p.m., we will start to hear the replies to the debate at about 12:30 p.m. And I call we have to wait for Mrs. Selnes to come.
The vice chair that takes.
Okay, you can start. The next item of business this morning is the debate on the report titled An Urgent Call to Europe and its partners, envisioning immediate and long-term policy solutions in support of the displaced people of Ukraine, presented by Mrs. Lisa Selnes on behalf of the Committee on Migration, Refugees and Displaced Persons. In order to finish by 1 p.m., we will start to hear the replies to the debate at about 12:13 p.m. I draw to members' attention that a revised compendium of amendments for the debate on document 16002 has been issued this morning. I call Mrs. Selnes, rapporteur. You have 10 minutes now and 3 minutes at the end to reply to the debate. The floor is yours.
Madam President, dear colleagues, an urgent call to Europe and its partners, envisioning immediate and long-term policy solutions in support for the displaced people of Ukraine. This report is about the people of Ukraine. To keep a people-centered approach in policymaking in times of crisis is crucial, bearing in mind the importance of finding the right balance between protecting civilians affected by the war and enhancing the capacity of the state to defend itself. When its existence is under threat, appropriate consideration should be given. This report spans far and wide and is about the people in Ukraine who no longer live in their homes. The people who have fled to Europe, 5.9 million people, 500,000 people outside Europe. It is still necessary that the solidarity made by countries in Europe, the Temporary Protection Act, must continue, and we call upon the states to prolong this or look at the opening of new avenues that also will make it possible for Ukrainian refugees to get access to rights available for asylum seekers. In this framework, it among several things, is very important to get access to labor markets, housing, the importance of school and culture, and of course language, the importance of creating opportunities for the displaced people from Ukraine to preserve and promote their cultural heritage. One group I especially want to mention, in addition to the children, are the elderly people living abroad, granting them status as pensioners. This is also important. As for the internally displaced people, the people that are, you can say it, refugees in their own country, around 5 million people, they do not live in their homes anymore. These people stayed after the invasion. Maybe their homes were broken. Maybe they want to support their loved ones in war. This report asks for resolute actions to contribute to the protections of IDPs in Ukraine, especially with an emphasis on internally displaced children and their families. Long-term support programs for IDPs while living in Ukraine for housing, schools, social support, access to labor market. As regards the third group that I will mention, the forcible displaced children of Ukraine. I note that the children of Ukraine have suffered incredible hardship since the beginning of the Russian Federation's aggression. Specific measures must be put in place to help children retained in the Federation of Russia or Belarus against their will to be reunited with their family in Ukraine or elsewhere in Europe. It is a need to enhance cooperation between various parties and mechanisms to help return forcibly displaced children. Third-party interventions can offer guarantees for impartiality and effectiveness. As regards the prisoners of war, the fourth group, the Assembly should address the issue and the efforts deployed to negotiate the release as a matter of urgency. The bogus trials opened by the occupying forces of the Russian Federation against the Ukrainian prisoners of war should be halted, as they are unlawful under international humanitarian and human rights law. The tragedy of displacement will leave a definite mark on the lives of the people of Ukraine. This report sets the scene for the future targeted actions. It highlights the needs of specific groups of people, the internally displaced persons, the persons who fled the war of aggression and are now under temporary protection in Europe, and those who are forcibly displaced or deported to the Russian Federation and Belarus, either prisoners of war or forcibly displaced children. The tragedy of displacement will leave a defining mark on the lives of the people of Ukraine. The international community should do its utmost to ensure that they are protected. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Selnes, for your statement. Now we move to the debate. And we will first hear from the speakers on behalf of the political groups. I call first Laura Castel on behalf of UEL.
Thank you, Chair. First, let me, on behalf of our group, convey our gratitude to the rapporteur for this resolution. We strongly support what the report emphasizes. That is to say, the necessity for reinforced international solidarity and increased support for refugees and internally displaced persons within Ukraine. This aggression, this war, has reinforced inequalities and suffering among vulnerable Ukrainian population. This is why European countries and other international actors must mobilize resources to address urgent humanitarian needs. We do agree that the current situation in Ukraine is unacceptable and constitutes a flagrant violation of fundamental human rights, which we fight for within this organization. In this sense, forced deportations, especially of children, are an attempt by Russia to destroy Ukraine's national identity. Concrete actions are required to support Ukrainian people, ensuring the protection and return of deported children. It is our duty to work together to put an end to these violations of human rights. However, from our point of view, it is crucial and urgent not to forget other vulnerable populations who are also suffering around the world. Too often, our attention focuses on one crisis at a time, thereby neglecting other human tragedies. Conflicts in Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, Palestine, Kurdistan, and many other regions continue to cause unimaginable suffering. Refugees from these conflict zones deserve just as much as our attention and assistance. All the lives of all human beings have the same value, the same dignity, and they suffer in the same way. The international community must adopt a comprehensive and coherent approach to protect all refugees and displaced persons, regardless of their origin or the geopolitical context of their crisis. And regarding this, we, the Council of Europe, could use the example of mobilization for Ukraine to shed the light on other neglected conflicts and suffering. Thanks for this report again, and we encourage to support it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Castel. I now give the floor to Mrs. Anna Cristina Mikkonen on behalf of the Socialist Group. 3 minutes.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, the world is now faced with the most complex migration situation since the Second World War. Millions of Ukrainians have had to leave their homes and seek refuge elsewhere. Since the beginning of Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine, millions of Ukrainians have taken refuge in Europe, and more than 500,000 are internally displaced. In addition, Ukraine has about 5 million IDPs, in addition to this very large number of externally displaced people. And this number will no doubt increase as the war continues. According to the United Nations, more than 14 million people, that is to say 40% of Ukrainians, will need humanitarian aid this year. This kind of assistance is more urgent than ever, and we must make sure that the conditions for return can be taken out, in particular especially taking into account deported children, and the people who have deported these children must be punished. The Russian Federation must immediately release all people who were forcibly transferred to Russia or elsewhere. Specific measures must be set up to help displaced children within Ukraine who are, in addition, traumatized by unceasing bombing by Russia. Specific individual measures must be set up. We need to communicate with the various players and international agencies who are ensuring that children receive what they need. We need initiatives to help Ukraine in order to defend itself and reconsolidate and rebuild its society in order to make sure that it is stronger and more resilient. We must also invest in Ukraine's resilience, and this will help Europe to be stronger as a whole and develop better protected frontiers. We need an international compensation mechanism where the Council of Europe is prepared to play a role and whose foundation is being discussed alongside that of an international tribunal. This is difficult work, but we're going to do it. At this difficult moment, we must not hesitate to support Ukraine, and the time has come to pay particular attention to the consolidation of sustainable peace. I would like to call upon you to support this report and its resolution. Slava Ukraini.
And now the floor goes to Mr. Kamelchuk on behalf of the EPP-CD group. Please, the floor is yours, 3 minutes.
Dear Chair, honorable members of Parliamentary Assembly, I would like to thank our rapporteur, Ms. Liz Selnes. And at the beginning, I need to remind you that the war of Russia against Ukraine started in 2014 from Ukrainian peninsula Crimea. And I was in Yalta in that day, and I'll never forget this feeling and the smell of the war. Today, I bring to your urgent attention the dire situation forced by the displaced people of Ukraine, a humanitarian crisis that necessitates our immediate and long-term commitment. As the war conflict persists, over 14.6 million Ukrainians require humanitarian assistance. Tragically, by the end of 2023, funding for refugee protection needs meet only 53% of necessary resources. This report presents targeted actions addressing the needs of various displaced groups, those internally displaced within Ukraine, those under temporary protection in Europe, and those forcibly displaced to the Russian Federation and Belarus. The profound impact of displacement on Ukrainians underscores the necessity for the international community to safeguard their rights and facilitate their involvement in Ukraine's post-war recovery. We must advocate for the release of individuals forcibly moved to Russia and Belarus and enhance cooperation between parties and assist the return of displaced children. Our support must encompass both immediate humanitarian aid and long-term recovery strategies. Notably, in March 2024, the European Commission disbursed €4.5 billion as part of new Ukraine facility aiding Ukraine in maintaining essential public services. Looking ahead, long-term support for internally displaced persons should include access to social, housing, and financial aid for rebuilding homes and starting new businesses. With Ukraine's recent accession to the Council of Europe Development Bank in July 2024, we can now extend emergency assistance and foster the integration of Ukrainian temporarily displaced persons and IDPs. Particularly for Ukraine's children abroad, more robust regulatory measures are necessary to protect their rights in host countries, ensuring access to the education, healthcare, and social support. Prioritizing the teaching of the Ukrainian language is vital and in preserving their national identity and facilitating the integration of Ukrainian students into the European education system. Moreover, the issue of Ukrainian prisoners of war remains critical. Following the Assembly written declaration number 778, we call on the International Committee of the Red Cross and the international community to enforce compliance with international humanitarian law by the Russian Federation. In conclusion, the Assembly is committed to support Ukraine in creating safe conditions for its displaced citizens, aiding their eventual return, and rebuilding a strong, resilient Ukraine that upholds the values shared by the Council of Europe member states. Thank you for your commitment to this pressing issue.
Thank you, Mr. Kamelchuk. The next speaker is Markus Wichel on behalf of the ECDA Group. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President. Our rapporteur, Mr. Salmon, has in record time written a very good report on a highly important and complicated subject, namely what needs to be done following the displacement of over 10 million Ukrainians from their homes, whether abroad in Europe or beyond or in Ukraine itself. This comes following Russia's unprovoked and utterly cruel and brutal invasion of the country. Not since the years following the Second World War has Europe experienced something on this level. As our rapporteur points out, we must not only provide sufficient immediate assistance to those displaced, but we must also recognize that we are in this for the long haul. As far as the material aspects are concerned, we must work on the basis of thought out plans coordinated between all our donor states. Many such projects, for instance, in the physical reconstruction of bombed-out cities, will, however, of course, have to await an eventual end to hostilities, an end that must be acceptable and coordinated with Ukraine. We must also remain aware that of the sensitive post-traumatic state of many of the refugees in connection with their evacuation. Not only just the loss of their homes, but possibly also something worse, namely the loss or separation of their children or their partners killed in battle, or relatives or friends that disappeared. Those displaced to Russia or Belarus, whether by force or not, including children, may be sent there for Russification, must also be approached if at all feasible. My group and myself feel proud about Free Europe's rapid and massive military and other support that has been supplied to our Ukrainian fellow Europeans. I am convinced that additional future assistance will continue, including from the rapporteur's own home country, Norway, whose aid, along with that of many other countries, is very impressive. Our group looks forward to what promises to be a highly fruitful debate. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Mr. Wichel. Next speaker is Mrs. Kravchuk on behalf of the group, ALDE Group.
Madam Chair. Is it working? Can you hear me now?
Does it work?
No.
Okay.
Apparently, well, I can give you a hint. It works only when you have the badge to vote. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, our rapporteur. It's a very important report for both those Ukrainians who seek temporary shelter outside of Ukraine in the member states, and I thank you for this support. But also, for the first time, we tackled the issue of the internally displaced people of Ukraine. This is very important because we have over 5 million of them inside of Ukraine, and they need aid as well. And of course, the situation with abducted civilians, especially abducted Ukrainian kids. Today, more than 5.9 million Ukrainian citizens have found a temporary shelter in Europe, with an additional 500,000 displaced outside the continent. Inside Ukraine, approximately 5 million people remain internally displaced, continue to live in uncertainty. In this vital moment, adopting a people-centered approach to policy making is imperative. The Parliamentary Assembly must advocate for enhanced support directed towards internally displaced persons, IDPs, within Ukraine. Swift humanitarian aid is vital, particularly for children and their families, as well as elderly who are among the most vulnerable. For those displaced outside Ukraine and currently under temporary protection in Europe, EU member states should commit to granting the right to legal residence after a 3-year period. Additionally, we must urge the immediate release of those individuals, especially kids, forcibly transferred or deported to the Russian Federation and Belarus. Third-party interventions can offer the impartiality and effectiveness needed to achieve these goals. We would be grateful for any help. Comprehensive support for Ukrainians inside and outside the country is non-negotiable. This includes financial assistance, access to social housing, and support for IDPs aspiring to rebuild their lives and start businesses. I would really like to thank the rapporteur to include a reference to my report that was voted yesterday. So the Assembly highlights the importance of creating opportunities for the displaced people of Ukraine to preserve and promote their cultural heritage, facilitate their access to their own heritage, encouraging cultural exchange programs, partnerships, joint artistic collaborations, and the organization of cultural festivals and exhibitions, provide support and resources for artists, writers, musicians, and other cultural professionals by funding initiatives, grants, and resident programs, promote the Ukrainian language by supporting independent publishers and translations of Ukrainian literature, and by setting up dedicated bookshelves in libraries. Supporting this draft resolution is not just an act of solidarity, it's a moral thing to do, it's our duty, of course, and we are thankful for that. By adopting this resolution, we affirm our commitment to protecting the rights of Ukrainian citizens and providing much-needed support to those devastated by war. Together, we can help restore hope, dignity, and justice to the millions of Ukrainians. Thank you. Slava Ukraini.
Thank you, Mrs. Kravchuk. The speeches on behalf of the political groups are concluded. The next speaker is Mr. Savikas.
Dear
Please.
President, dear colleagues, we stand today at a pivotal moment in history, where, of course, our solidarity, our compassion, our resolve are being tested by the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. And today we are called upon to envision and implement both immediate and long-term policy solutions to support millions of displaced by this tragic war. Over 5.9 million Ukrainians have sought refuge in Europe, and additional 500,000 have fled to countries outside Europe. Within Ukraine, around 5 million people are internally displaced, and their lives uprooted and their futures uncertain. Our response must be robust and multifaceted. First and foremost, we must ensure that temporary protection granted to Ukrainians is extended and that legal pathways for their long-term residence are facilitated. The European Union's Temporary Protection Directive has been a lifeline, but we must build upon this foundation to provide lasting security and stability. Humanitarian aid remains a critical priority. Approximately 14.6 million people in Ukraine require assistance, with urgent needs in housing, healthcare, and of course, education. Displaced children and families must be at the forefront of our aid efforts, ensuring we receive the support necessary to rebuild their lives. Furthermore, we must address the legal status of displaced Ukrainians under temporary protection. We must support Ukraine not just during this conflict, but in the long-term recovery and rebuilding efforts that will follow. And this, of course, includes the safe return and reintegration of displaced individuals, particularly children who have been forcibly removed from their families. And our international partners and humanitarian agencies play an indispensable role. We must collaborate closely with them to ensure that aid reaches those in need and that their framework for their return and reintegration is strong and effective. The scale of this crisis obligates us to act decisively. The Council of Europe must lead in supporting Ukraine's reconstruction and compensating for the damages caused by Russia's aggression, and we must push for a transfer of frozen Russian state assets to an international compensation mechanism under our auspices, ensuring that funds are being used to rebuilding Ukraine and supporting displaced persons. Our journey from sanctions to effective countermeasures begins here. This report is a crucial step. I welcome it, I thank the rapporteur, and hopefully we'll have unanimous support. Thank you.
Thank you. In the debate, I call next Mrs. Christoffersen.
Madam President, dear colleagues, I want to thank my Norwegian colleague for her work on this important report on people displaced by Russia's war against Ukraine. There are nearly 6 million Ukrainian refugees in other European countries, almost as many internally displaced within Ukraine itself, and in addition, 500,000 who have sought refuge in countries outside Europe. This is a human disaster that is almost impossible to comprehend. My home country, Norway, has a population of 5.5 million. And the number of displaced persons from and within Ukraine is twice as many. Like other countries, Norway has granted temporary collective protection to refugees from Ukraine. The report raises an important question: what if the war becomes long-lasting? This is a topic with many aspects. Ukraine wants their people to return home. Primarily, those who have fled want the same. On the other hand, if the war is lengthy, they might have settled in their host countries. The report calls for permanent residence permits to be granted after 3 years. The Council of Europe member states should promptly need to address this issue. However, the most important question raised in the report is the need for our support of internally displaced persons within Ukraine itself. This support should be increased significantly. The municipalities in Ukraine hardest hit by the war need our support in order to take care of their residents. Likewise, our support is really needed in Ukrainian municipalities who receive large numbers of internally displaced persons. One of the most important things to do is to ensure money to pay salaries, pensions, social support, and basic public services. In this way, we can help prevent that more people have to leave their country. Humanitarian organizations, including the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, operating in war-torn areas and in the regions where internally displaced are fleeing, also need our support. They facilitate urgent life-saving measures, humanitarian assistance like shelter, blankets, clothing, housing, and cash to cover essential living expenses for the most vulnerable, among them children. No one knows how the war will develop. Areas where internally displaced persons have sought safety may become unsafe. Thus, we also need to prepare for new flows of Ukrainian refugees to our countries. As the rapporteur states, it's urgent. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mr. Sobolyev. You have to push just one.
Thank
okay,
you, yes.
It's working.
Thank you, Madam Rapporteur, for your excellent report. I think it's a big theme that we need to discuss not only on this session, but for a long period of time. And of course, it's impossible to start my speech without the big thanks to all your governments, your parliaments, all over the world, first of all of European countries, countries that are the members of European Union, Canada, the United States, Turkey, and many, many other countries that are not the members of European Union, for all your programs of temporary protected, United for Ukraine, that is given now possibility for millions of Ukrainians and their families to protect their life in such circumstances. It's no figures. It's no official figures. We know only the figures of those who are registered in the countries, for example, of European Union, in the United States, in Canada, in Turkey. It's near 5 million people. But it's no figures of our displaced persons who are now in Ukraine. Official figure is more than 5 million, but you must understand it's twice more, because most of these people are living in the families of their relatives or friends. So you can imagine, before the war, in 2014, we have 41 million population. 15 million now are living abroad or on other territories inside Ukraine, and they need their help. But it's very important, maybe in other reports also, to stress the situation about all those who lost their houses since the first invasion of Russia and occupation of Crimea, the part of Lugansk and Donetsk Oblast, where hundreds of thousands of these people, Ukrainians, Crimea Tatars, and many, many other nationalities, has to leave their houses. So for us, it's very important to understand that it's not only a case of some concrete spheres, but I want to stress only one case. When the leader of the second biggest faction in the Russian parliament, Mr. Mironov, decided to have a child from Kherson who has parents, who has grandmother, so they captured this child, and now she is living in the family of second biggest leader of fraction of Russia. I think it's a good example how Russians decided to use all these circumstances in order to do all to dissimulate Ukrainian nation. So for us, your support in this report, it's a real prohibition of all of our citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you. In the debate, I call next Lord Russell. Please, the floor is yours.
Grazie, Presidente. I'd like to start off by thanking the rapporteur for a very timely report. I first had the pleasure of going to Ukraine as part of the monitoring team from the Council of Europe in 2019. I went there 3 times. I was there with the pre-election, for the first round of the campaign, and for the second. And it was a very memorable occasion. I remember in particular the large amount of IDPs that there were, and the very smooth way in which they were dealt with in each of the polling stations we visited. For the second round, it was like being in a large party. The atmosphere was positive, was optimistic. Everybody felt there was a real chance to try and get away from some of the legacy issues that Ukraine had, in particular the rather malign influence of Russia. Alas, of course, this was too good to be true. I was hoping to go back to Ukraine later on that year, in fact, to be the leader of the monitoring team for the parliamentary election. However, the Ukrainian government, quite understandably, withdrew the invitation for PACE to come, because in the interim, in what was probably not this Assembly's finest moment, it voted to readmit Russia. Not, I think, with the benefit of hindsight, a particularly clever thing to do. Today, 28 months after Russia reinvaded the Ukraine, we are clearly in a situation where there is a danger of fatigue, war weariness, competing crises all over the world, political, military, and economic. And as the previous speaker has said, the staggering fact that between 1/3 and 1/2 of the Ukrainian population in one form or another is dispossessed from where they would normally like to live is staggering. This report is very timely, and it's not simply about Ukraine, it is about us all. And all of the different elements within this report are interlinked. It sets a considerable challenge for our states and a considerable challenge for us. I think the lesson that I have drawn from this sort of problem was exemplified when we had a meeting with the executive director of Frontex a couple of days ago, and he said the way in which to deal with these sorts of problems is cooperate, cooperate, cooperate. So what I would suggest should be the case, I know in the case of Ukrainian children who are dispossessed, there is a fantastic network information hub where it is possible for anybody to go in and understand exactly what is happening with those children wherever they are. Could I suggest that if the same was the case with all of the other dispossessed people, it would be much easier for my government, for example, to be able to see what other governments were doing, to compare best practice, evolving best practice, and what doesn't work. And if that doesn't exist at the moment, I think it would be a very good idea. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Russell. The floor goes to Mrs. Vasilienko.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, colleagues, for this active discussion and the proposals therein. And of course, thank you to Liz Selners, who has done a tremendous job covering the so many complex aspects and challenges of the forced migration that Ukrainians suffer as a result of Russia's continued aggression against Ukraine. I take this opportunity also to thank all the hosting communities that have welcomed Ukrainians, provided homes and shelter to those in need at the most difficult times. When we are talking about the numbers of the displaced Ukrainians, they are more than 10 million. More than 10 million people who have had to flee their homes at risk of physical extermination by Russia. Some 5 million Ukrainians are internally displaced, choosing to remain inside Ukraine, but over 6 million have chosen to move abroad, predominantly have spread across Europe. These numbers are not exact, however, and they can never be exact. You see, Ukrainians are not refugees in the classical understanding of the term. Rather, we are temporarily displaced persons, and we behave as such. Through the past few years, we have seen waves of Ukrainians going in and out of the country. First, when the escalation of the aggression started, then when some of the territories of Ukraine have been liberated, Ukrainians have come back to the country, then when there has been an escalation of the air raids and the nightly attacks and the blackouts, then the Ukrainians have again, in waves, have started to flee the country again. Who are these millions of people we are talking about? 46% of the displaced Ukrainians are women and 33% are children. The majority of the remaining 21% are the elderly. For Ukraine, this demographical statistics is a true tragedy. This is our human capital gone. How do we get it back? Well, the best way is to give Ukraine more military aid and give it fast, so we can end this war fast and make every part of Ukraine safe and livable again for our people. We are working hard on this scenario at all political and diplomatical levels, and we are grateful to all you friends who are pushing for victory together with us. Every day that our preferred scenario is not materializing, it becomes less and less realistic that all of the Ukrainians will come back home. 3 years of life abroad is enough to not only adapt and integrate, but also to be on the way to full assimilation. We have to accept the fact that the longer the children stay in their new school systems, the harder and hence less likely it will be for them to go back home. We have to accept the fact that the new families may have formed in this time in the new host countries. As we have to realize that most of our people have learned a new language and found jobs, they may be reluctant to leave. Their host communities may also be reluctant to let them go, especially given how the coming of the Ukrainians has allowed for the rise of GDP in several Eastern European countries. We observed this with great sadness in Ukraine. The only thing we can do to mitigate the situation is to ensure that a strong link remains between the Ukrainians who have left and the country Ukraine. And for this, again, we require the help and the funding from the host communities. It is not a big ask, but an ask still. And it would mean a lot to the displaced people of Ukraine and to a country who cannot yet welcome these people home. Thank you.
Thank you. I call next Mr. Stamatis.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me to speak in my native language, in Greek.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I would like to start with something that Garcia Lorca had said. I will always be by the side of those who are destitute and who are not given the possibility to enjoy in peace the few things that they do have. But the Ukrainians have us, and we have the Ukrainians. I would like to believe that after this excellent report, that this report shall not be prophetic about the years to come. It shall not be prophetic, I hope. But we must bring this war to an end. Otherwise, it might be continued by others like Putin. We have to be prepared. Already, the European Commission is talking about whether it's going to have a portfolio for defence. And you see that we're talking more about war rather than peace. We're talking more about humanitarian aid rather than how we are going to build a Europe of peace. Every day, people around the world are trying to do away with democracy. We saw this in Bolivia the day before, and that must mean that we, as defenders of human rights, the rule of law and democracy here in the Council, we must see what our role will be in the next day. Will it be simply writing reports? Or must we, through our positions in the countries where we're parliamentarians, to be ever more active? I had the good fortune to be responsible for humanitarian aid to Ukraine from Greece. 25,000 Ukrainians live in Greece. What does this report show? That when the member states work together, very specific programs can be set up, giving humanitarian aid to those in need. But we must be prepared to look to the future. Certain Ukrainians might not return back home. They may remain in Greece, France, Poland. The member states must help these people to build a new life. On the other hand, we also have people with disabilities, and the environment in Ukraine is very difficult for them. We have the elderly, and they find it very hard to live in Ukraine. What does this report show us? That we must set up programs for social housing, those programs that will give the possibility for these people who will be ambassadors to peace because they are refugees within Europe, to help build a new tomorrow for them. But is this the solution? Or is the solution to bring an end to the war? I repeat this. We're not talking about the war stopping. We're talking about all the rest, how to help people, and that's all good and well. But the war is not ending. And why doesn't it end? Because, ladies and gentlemen, we have the new industry, that of armament. And, of course, this war can continue solely for this. We're in favour of the Ukrainian people, in favour of the poor and vulnerable groups. And I welcome this report because it gives us the possibility for these people to have a better tomorrow where they are living. But I believe that in every time that we take the floor and we refer to Ukraine, we must refer to the Russians and we must tell them, give back the prisoners of war, and you should be in favour of democracy, and Europe will be able to work with you, because each Ukrainian is also, in fact, so each and every one of us could find ourselves in such a fate. So yesterday you saw that the flame was here. The flame did not go to Ukraine. The International Olympic Committee did not take it to Ukraine in order to give a lesson to Putin that we are fighting for the Olympic ideals and for democracy and freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stamatis. I call next Mr. Frides.
Thank you, Madam President. Ladies and gentlemen, in May 2022, I was entrusted with an initial mission addressing this issue 2 months after the beginning of the war. I traveled to the west of Ukraine, to Ozhgorod and Chernivtsi, to take stock of the humanitarian situation and the state of the IDPs. We're talking about 5 or 6 million people back then. Ozhgorod, close to the border with Slovakia, where the normal population was 100,000 people, some 500,000 had gathered in this municipality, which put the local authorities under enormous pressure, but they and the local people responded fantastically. Soup kitchens were open, all sorts of support was provided to the refugees. So that work has continued. Back then, we underlined the importance of twinning schemes between European and Ukrainian cities. This is still a very important priority. We've heard figures 3.5 million, up to 5 million internally displaced persons, and these people really do need help. Back in June, I represented the Parliamentary Assembly in a meeting in Lublin in Poland, representing the towns and cities of Europe. That's a town just across the border from Ukraine, and there were representatives from Ukraine, from Kharkiv and other towns. When I spoke to these people, I realized the enormous emotional roller coaster they've been going through. They often broke down into tears. They were exhausted. These meetings gave me the opportunity to take the measure of the enormous needs in the country. Most resources in the country have, understandably enough, been mobilized for the war effort, but they still face rebuilding, humanitarian aid for these people who've lost everything. And I was very much struck by what Mr. Franckvis said. He talked about the need to build hospitals. Many people in Ukraine are physically and psychically damaged. They've lost limbs. So the proposal was to build a new hospital in the city. They need 3 million euros, which doesn't sound very much for us, but for them it's an enormous sum of money. We also have to bear in mind the fact that at some stage the war will end, which means the next phase will, of course, be rebuilding. There's an enormous need to build new housing so that people can go back home. It would also be impossible to remove landmines. That's being addressed by a separate report. So people want to go back to their hometowns, but in many cases they have to be made safe first of all. The international community must demonstrate once again practical solidarity. We have to ensure that money be made available immediately so as to enable these people to survive and live in decent conditions while waiting peace. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Frides. I call next Mr. Tistik.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, dear Rapporteur, dear colleagues. First of all, I would like to say thank you all the countries that sheltered Ukrainians and became a second home from them after the start of full-scale war. I support all those measures outlined in the resolution aimed at continuing to provide support to Ukraine and Ukrainian citizens abroad, as well as calling for the release of forcibly displaced or deported persons and the return for forcibly displaced children. However, this war has very strong and inevitable consequences for Ukraine. The war caused a powerful migration in Ukraine, both internally and externally. We are already facing labor shortages that are affecting the economy and social fabric of the country. We have a big demographic crisis. According to forecasts, 15 years after the end of the war, the population in Ukraine will decrease by approximately 10–12 million. We look at the situation realistically and understand that a certain number of Ukrainian migrants will be able to adapt to new countries and will not to return. Part of internally displaced Ukrainians who left their homes in the occupied territories and where hostilities continue will not return either. Danger, rocket fire, and acknowledge of how long the war will create unacceptable conditions for their birth rate. All of this creates serious challenges, both and now in the future for our nation and its stability. That's why the main call for all our partners is decisive action for comprehensive political and financial support and strengthening of Ukrainian defense capabilities. Only the end of the war on the terms of Ukraine and our Ukrainian partners and establishment of fair peace will be able to return Ukrainians home. Infrastructure, construction, economic development and security will be the basic for the return and integration of our citizens. I'm sure that it is important for the European Union to have a stable, developed and prosperous neighboring country next to it. Ukraine can become such a partner that will contribute to strengthening stability and security in the entire region. Dear colleagues, this is important not only for Ukraine, but also for whole Europe, as the stability of our country and our countries will contribute to economic development, reducing migratory pressure and ensuring security on the eastern borders of EU. Thank you. Slava Ukraini.
Thank you. I call next Mrs. Jasko.
Dear colleagues, I want to join incredibly big gratitude to all of the member states, all of the countries that provided not only generosity, it was unprecedented, open heart, hand that is incredibly much appreciated by all of us. I remember all that days and weeks in the beginning, how tragic, how dramatic it all was. And sometimes for Ukrainians who, after days of traveling, after being internally and externally displaced, would finally have a warm tea of some people maybe who would open their houses without even knowing them, somewhere abroad in an unknown country. It sounds like a fairy tale, you know? I think we should remember about that, because it opens something inside us. The second thing I want to say is that we believe that we should call those people those Ukrainians who are currently abroad and having temporary protection, not refugees, but externally displaced people, because there is a big difference. Most of these people, Ukrainians, are working right now. And I want to thank you for granting access to the work, to the job market, for receiving education and health. It's incredibly important. And I want to ask you to be pragmatic in a good way. Sooner or later, we will need very urgent steps on Ukraine recovery. We're talking a bit right now. I was at Berlin Recovery Conference recently, but we need to have specialists. We need to have trained people. And very often when some people abroad ask me, what shall we do with Ukrainians in our countries? I say, please include them and provide them knowledge and the skills through education that you could later use for our bilateral recovery projects. You have people now that speak Ukrainian and speak other languages. And that's very beneficial for us and for you. To end up, I just want to say again one more time, thank you, because this is not just words. I know it also from my personal story that it was very important for me that members of my family were also welcomed in some of your countries for some time, and I'm very grateful for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Elisaveta. I call next Mrs. Boniface.
Honorable colleagues, Canada is home to the second largest Ukrainian diaspora in the world. Indeed, almost 1 in every 24 Canadians, close to 4% of the Canadian population, is of Ukrainian origin. That's why when the Putin regime launched its barbaric full-scale invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022, displacing millions of Ukrainians from their homes, we felt a particular sting. As a former Speaker of the Senate of Canada said weeks after the invasion, and I quote, "For Canadians, Ukraine is permanently woven into the fabric of our culture. Ukraine, simply put, is family." In March 2022, the Canadian government created the Canada-Ukraine Authorization for Emergency Travel, or QA measures. Through the program, Ukrainian nationals and their family members overseas could apply for a special temporary resident visa free of charge to be authorized to stay and work or study in Canada for up to 3 years. And Ukrainian nationals and their family members already in Canada could apply in Canada for open work permits, study permits, or extend their stay for up to 3 years. As of the 23rd of March this year, 286,752 Q8 holders had arrived in Canada, and many were supported with temporary accommodations and transitional financial assistance. But Canada, of course, is far from the front lines of the war. And so many of your countries have been and continue to be incredibly generous in supporting millions of displaced Ukrainians. As the rapporteur's report rightly highlights, European Union member states have demonstrated incredible solidarity through the European Union Temporary Protective Directive, welcoming 4.5 million Ukrainians as of the end of February. Members of the Canadian delegation saw that firsthand in October 2022 when they visited Poland. It's no secret, however, that our country's protective measures, particularly for Ukrainian men, have become a matter of significant debate in Ukraine as it tries to mobilize more soldiers for the war effort. As Rapporteur Selna's report notes, Ukrainians' new mobilization law, which came into force in May, bars Ukrainian men between the age of 20 and 60 from obtaining passports at the consular offices outside of the country. This leaves our governments with some questions, and we hope we will get some answers. We want to do everything we can to support the Ukrainian people. At the same time, we don't want to undermine the Ukrainian war effort. For that reason, I'm paying particular attention to the input of our Ukrainian colleagues today. Thank you.
Thank you. I call next Mrs. Vilosier. You have the floor.
President, dear colleagues, friends, I would like to extend my gratitude to the rapporteur, Madam Liz Selnes, for this report paying so much attention to the support of Ukrainian people that were forced to leave their homes because of this brutal, bloody war. Can you perceive such number? 13 million Ukrainians are externally and internally displaced. And who would ever think that Europe and other countries will cope with such a challenge, receiving, open your homes, open your hearts for our people, more than 6 million Ukrainians, inactivated in Europe and granting immediately the temporary protection and extending these days to the 2026 already, this temporary protection. And without any delay, our people were granted social, medical protection, were granted access to education. And it is an unprecedented act of solidarity in the history of mankind. And it can be a prominent example how civilized world can receive refugees and displaced persons. And we will never forget what you did for us, never. And I will never forget when, with the first days of the full-fledged war, we were evacuated oncology children from the Sumy, Kharkiv, from Kiev, and how your countries were welcoming them. Germany, Finland, Spain, Italy, many of you welcomed these families with children with oncology, and they still undermined the treatment and treated very well. And you not only saved their life from war, but saved their life from illnesses. And this war demonstrates that in the face of adversity, there are a totally different world. The world of compassion, solidarity, and human dignity, and the world of totalitarian Russia regime that is abducting children, torturing, killing and raping, where the raping is the norm. And children are kidnapped, where their identity is erased. They are undergoing military training to fight against their own people. And of course, I would also like to stress on not only on children that are abducted, and the number is a huge, 20,000. It's confirmed, and we have also numbers 200,000 confirmed children that are kidnapped by Russia. But also our soldiers, our militants that are missing, that mothers cannot even bury. They don't know whether their children are alive or not. And can you imagine to feel this, to have this feeling, not able even to bury your children? So please be in solidarity with us. Please support Ukraine. Please help us to return each person that is missing or abducted by Russia. We cannot and we must not allow this injustice to continue, and Ukraine reaffirms its desire to return all of our citizens to our homeland, and we call for close cooperation to ensure that. Thank you, friends.
Thank you. I call next Mrs. Komenko. Please, the floor is yours.
Can I start? Sorry. Dear colleagues, I would like to thank the rapporteur for this comprehensive report substantially covering the issues of internally and externally displaced people of Ukraine, but also focusing on deported children, on prisoners of war and civilian hostages. This report is truly historic and very timely since the aggressive war rages on, making more and more Ukrainians leave their dear homes and cities, seeking safety either in other regions of Ukraine or abroad in your countries. Dear colleagues, today I would like to focus on a very pressing issue for Ukrainians. We all hope that the just peace will soon be established to enable our Ukrainians to return to Ukraine and contribute to rebuilding our country and ensuring a bright and prosperous future for all. In this regard, I thank the rapporteur for recognizing the importance of maintaining the connection of displaced Ukrainians with their home country, namely by supporting diaspora, cultural and educational events, and supporting Ukrainians in their desire to come back as soon as Ukraine wins. It is rightfully noted that we all need to explore the ways we can support displaced people from the long-term perspective. In this regard, it is crucial to remember that Ukrainian people must have the possibility to connect with Ukraine and return to Ukraine the way they wish to. Furthermore, it is especially crucial to understand that Ukraine as a state is responsible for Ukrainian children under the temporary protection who are deprived of parental care in terms of designating their legal guardians. Therefore, the states shall respect the rights of these children to maintain their connection with Ukrainian guardians and with Ukraine, with the view of future return of these children to Ukraine. With regard to deported Ukrainian children, it is essential to remember that the return of these children, including those deprived of parental care, is in line with the best interest of these children, as anonymously recognized by this Assembly in the resolution voted in January this year. Therefore, the illegal adoption of Ukrainian children by Russian families must be strongly condemned and stopped, and it is not in line with the best interest of the child to be adopted by Russians and to stay in Russia. Ukraine keeps fighting to protect its citizens wherever they are, and we really on your support. We rely really on your support in this regard. I thank everyone who supports displaced Ukrainians, and I thank very much the rapporteur for raising this issue before the Assembly. Thank you, dear colleagues.
Thank you, Olena. The next speaker is Mr. Libicki. Please, you have
Hello?
minutes.
Okay. Madam Chair, dear colleagues, first, many thanks to Lisa Selnes for her very interesting and important report. We all hope the Russian aggression against Ukraine will end as soon as possible. It will end with the Ukrainians' victory. However, as long as this does not happen, a long-term and coordinated policy toward Ukrainian war refugees who are abroad or are internal refugees is needed. This is a particularly important issue for Poland because we have many guests from Ukraine, and even those who did not stay in Poland reached Poland in the first days of the war and then possibly went further. In May 2022, 3 months after Russian aggression, as the chairman of the Family, Seniority and Social Policy Committee in the Polish Senate, I initiated such a meeting of various public institutions supporting Ukrainian refugees residing in Poland at this time. Today, your report, Lisa, puts this issue at the European level. Thank you very much for this. It puts it at European level in 3 aspects: extending temporary protection or finding another legal form of replace it, regulating the stay of people already staying there, and providing assistance to internally displaced persons, as well as the very painful issue of repatriation of children abducted from Ukraine to Russia. However, I would like to draw attention to one more aspect. For people close to me, people with disabilities. This includes both people with disabilities who were disabled before the outbreak of the war, but also those who became disabled as a result of war activities. For these people, the member states of our Assembly should develop separate forms of support, both for internal refugees whom we help in Ukraine and for these staying abroad. A separate issue is support for these who became internal or external refugees because having become disabled as a result of war, they had to change the place of residence while seeking the treatment. Lisa, I think your excellent report is an important first step in resolving all these issues. At the end of my speech, I would like to inform you, Madam Chair, that I was mistaken during the voting our resolution about Georgia this morning. I voted against, but I am, of course, for this resolution, so I would like to give you this information. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Libicki. I must now interrupt the list of speakers. The speeches of members on the speakers list who have been present during the debate but have not been able to speak may be given to the table office for publication in the official report. I remind colleagues that the typewritten texts can be submitted electronically, if possible, no later than 4 hours after the list of speakers is interrupted. And now I call Mrs. Selnes to reply. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, and thank all of you for the great support on this report. It was very interesting to hear the different perspectives. I would like to comment on a few of those. First of all, when it comes to the externally displaced people, those Ukrainians who live in the European countries or countries outside Europe, I will ask you all, when you come back, to look at all the things that your government are doing, because there are a lot of differences between how the countries meet this group of people. And think about the things that you can see in the report. How do you help the elderly people, pensioners? What do you do about schools? What do you do for the Ukrainian population in your country when it comes to language learning, Ukrainian culture, and so on? What kind of things do your country do when it comes to helping people getting jobs and work or learning the language of the country they're in? These are important questions that I ask my parliamentarian colleagues to address when they come back to their own parliament to meet this big group of externally displaced people in Europe. When it comes to the internally displaced people, we also have a big job to do, and I heard a lot of you talked about it earlier. I would also ask ourselves to think about how can we help Ukraine in meeting the need of the enormous amount of people who are internally displaced in Ukraine. Then Lord Russell was talking about the need to build hospitals. We can talk about how to build schools, how to build societies and make people work. How we meet this challenge will affect on how many more refugees or externally displaced people will come to Europe. So we need to help Ukraine meet the needs. And of course, and in the end, we all want the war to end. But this report reflects on the situation we are in here and now, where several million of people have left their houses, and we need to take political action to make their lives safe, both in Europe, in other places, other countries in the world, but also inside Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Elnes. Mr. Goncharenko, do you wish to speak as chairperson of the committee? Yes, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Dear colleagues, extremely important report. And I want to thank Madam Selnes and fantastic secretariat of our committee for a fantastic job done in very short terms, because it was really done in very short terms, but we don't have time to waste, unfortunately, because there are very serious questions right now with Ukrainian displaced people, both internally and externally. And that's why this is so in time. I just want to remind you that the crisis with Ukrainians after this Russian full-scale invasion is the biggest humanitarian catastrophe in Europe from the time of the Second World War. Just imagine, we're speaking about more than 10 million people. It's more than population of many countries, of member states of the Council of Europe. For some countries, it's like 3, 4, 5 times more. Just imagine, 10 million people, and in reality, the number is bigger. Bigger, because more than 5 million are abroad, more than 5 million are inside the country, and many people are unregistered. And that is so awful and so calling for us to react. And finally, in this resolution, we address several groups of people. We address internally displaced people with a clear call to protect their rights, also to Ukrainian government, but also with help of all international community, to live, to find their place in the new places where they are, to have where to live, to have residence, to start business, and so on, which is so important today. Secondly, by the way, we address for the first time the problems of internally displaced children, which is so important. They are so traumatized, and they need to be protected. We are speaking about externally displaced people, and we already have good news. Just recently, several days ago, European Union decided to continue to prolong the temporary protection status for them. But when we started to prepare the report, maybe it is also one of pushes from us. It was not still done. Now it is done. But there are many other questions about disabled people, about their rights, about aged people and their right to receive pension and social support, and other questions which are raised here, which is so important. One more about deported people, and including children, and about Ukrainian prisoners of war and captured civilians. And we address again, Assembly address immediate release of prisoners of war and captured civilians, immediate release. That is so important for tens of thousands of families in Ukraine and for humanity of all of us. So, dear friends, extremely important report. I want to ask all of you to support it. By this you will show your will, but also, please, when you will come back to your home countries, unfortunately in all your home countries there are displaced Ukrainians. And believe me, They are in very difficult situation. Please continue to support them. Please fulfill the recommendations which will be in this resolution, because we need not just resolution, but a concrete actions in all your countries to protect those who are in so big need. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your statement. Any amendment which has been unanimously approved by the committee sized for the report shall not be put to the vote in plenary and shall be declared as definitively approved unless 10 or more members of the Assembly object. I understand that the chairperson of the committee wishes to propose to the Assembly that amendments 3, 1, 6, and 7 to the draft resolution, which were unanimously approved, be declared as approved. Amendment 2 was also unanimously approved, but as it interacts with Amendment 5, we will take it separately. Is that so, Mr. Goncharenko? Yes. If no one objects, I will consider amendments 3, 1, 6, and 7 to be approved. Is there an objection? If there is, we will need to verify that the objection has the required support of 10 people. Please, could those... Oh, okay. Is there an objection? So we have to verify.
Dear colleagues, I have the objection
no time. We have to verify if there are 10 people or more that support the objection. If there are, please raise your hands.
With a microphone, please.
No objections? No, 10? No?
Please could Mrs. Homenko speak into a microphone?
Yes, I have an objection to rejection of the amendment number 8. So just tell me where is the right time.
We are talking about 3, 1, 6, 7, not 8. So, no. Yes. Okay. So, amendments 3, 1, 6, and 7 to the draft resolution are therefore approved and will not be called. Any amendment which has been rejected by the committee sized for report by a 2/3 majority of the votes cast shall not be put to the vote in plenary and shall be declared as definitively rejected unless 10 or more members of the Assembly object. I understand that the chairperson of the committee wishes to propose to the Assembly that amendments 4 and 8 to the draft resolution, which were rejected by the committee with a 2/3 majority, be declared as rejected. Amendment 5 was also rejected by 2/3 majority, but as it interacts with Amendment 2, we will take it separately. Is that so, Mr. Goncharenko? Yes. Okay. If no one objects, I will consider Amendments 4 and 8 to be rejected. Is there an objection? If there is, we will need to verify that the objection has the required support of 10 people. But
yes, there is an objection.
You can see it.
To Amendment 8.
You need to wait to see if there are 10 people.
We have to see if there are 10 people.
Yeah, we need.
No.
Yeah.
After.
After later.
First, we have to see if there are 10 people supporting the objection. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, there are 10. There are 10 people. The request of the committee is rejected, so each amendment will be taken individually in the order in which they appear in the compendium. 24. Okay, I call Mr. Frides to support Amendment 2. You have 30 seconds.
Madame la... Madam President. Thank you very much, Madam Vice President. The proposed text in Amendment 2 was accepted by the committee, but the problem was that I felt that this should be in para 13. The idea is to have a sub-amendment, which would mean that we could replace the text of para 13 with Amendment 2 as a whole, because what is in Amendment 2, which has been placed with the wrong paragraph, the idea is that we should put together 13 with the proposal, and this would actually lead to several repetitions between Amendment 2 and 13 if we were to merge them. The proposal, therefore, is to take Amendment number 2 as it stands and to use it to replace para 13, which would thereby be deleted, because everything in paragraph 13 is contained in Amendment 2.
Does anyone wish to speak against the amendment? The committee unanimously accepted this amendment, so I shall now put the amendment to the vote. The vote is open. The vote is closed. I call for the result to be displayed. So, the amendment is agreed.
Go to page 20.
Yes. I call Mrs. Komenko to support Amendment 8. You have 30 seconds.
In our resolution we have adopted in January this year, we decided that the best interest of the child deprived of parental care who was deported to Russia is to come back to Ukraine, is to be returned to Ukraine. So this amendment just reiterates the decision we have already taken in January this year. And we have an agreement with the rapporteur. I would like to add the wording, the reference to the Convention on the Rights of the Child to my amendment, so that it will correspond and it will suit both to opinion of the rapporteur and my opinion. Thank you. So please support the amendment number 8, amended by my oral sub-amendment, adding in line with the overarching principle of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. I want to add this wording in the end of my amendment number 8. Thank you. Please support.
We are speaking about Amendment 8, just Amendment 8. Okay. Does anyone wish to speak against the amendment? No? The committee rejected this amendment with a 2/3 majority. I shall now put the amendment to the...
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
The question is, can we now do it with the oral sub-amendment of which was said?
No. This is
Why?
the amendment.
We can't do with the oral
According
sub-amendment?
to the rules.
She can propose an oral amendment afterwards.
She can propose afterward, not now.
Okay, so now we need to proceed on amendment, and
Yeah.
after this, Madame Khomenko will have a possibility to give oral sub-amendment.
No.
There is the possibility, but you would rule against it.
No. This amendment, you rejected this amendment. So now we have to vote this amendment. Afterwards, the President may accept an oral amendment on the grounds of promoting clarity, accuracy, or conciliation, and if there is not opposition from 10 or more members to it, being debated. In my opinion, the oral amendment does not meet the criteria of Rule 34.7.a and therefore cannot be debated.
So we have to vote on Amendment 8.
So now we have to vote the Amendment 8 anyway. No, we have...
No, she didn't say it. You must vote on Amendment 8.
Now you have to vote the Amendment 8.
This can be discussed after the vote.
After the vote, it can be discussed after the vote. Now we have to vote the Amendment 8, please. This is...
Open the vote.
I open the vote on Amendment 8. The vote is closed. I call for the result to be displayed. The amendment is approved. We will now proceed to vote on the draft resolution as amended, contained in document 16002. The vote is open. The vote is closed. So, I call for the result to be displayed. Adopted. Unanimously. Unanimously. What? I don't understand.
People are saying that they didn't have time to vote. The vote is open. It is unanimously.
It is unanimously adopted. 3 seconds.
They wanted to vote, but they can't. It was too short.
I thought I waited.
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine.
It is unanimously adopted. So? So, the Assembly will hold its next public sitting this afternoon at 3:30 p.m. with the agenda approved on Monday. The sitting is adjourned.
Chaque fois,